words of welcome then to everybody. Thank you for being here. Hi, Hillary. I was just about to say, welcome to the Debs Center. To old friends and new friends too. My name is Ada Porter. I'm the director of the Debs Center and the secretary of the university. Amanda gave me about 45 seconds. So we've been in this office about 25 years. We've actually had a presence in New York City since the early 20th century, because this is where our board of trustees meets. So we've always had a presence in New York City. You will meet some of our colleagues here from alumni relations, fundraising, development, but we have staff really across the country now. So why are we here? Pre-COVID, pre-Thawra, pre-economic collapse, pre-Beirut blast in Lebanon, we thought, what can we do in New York City for Lebanon and for AUB? So we really need to start connecting our faculty members in their research with NGOs, think tanks, educational institutions in the Northeast across the country. And this kind of initiative, the Global Engagement Initiative, this is what we're doing now. So we're really thrilled to have you here. I am thrilled that Rami Khoury, who was our founding co-director of Global Engagement, is here, recently retired, along with Tania Haddad, our associate director of political science, and now our director of GEI from Beirut. So thank you for being here, and Amanda, I hope that was quick enough.
Yes. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, everyone. So this event is part of the Global Engagement Initiative. We work to help achieve AUB's mission to expand the global knowledge by sharing research and engaging in partnership worldwide. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ayman Mohyeldin, host of the MSNBC show Ayman. An award-winning foreign correspondent and investigative journalist, Ayman's work has spanned culture, politics, and current affairs across the Middle East, Central America, Asia, and Europe. His coverage of major events across the globe has brought a critical eye and much needed attention to some of the most important issues of our time, including and especially in the Arab region. Ayman has received a long list of international awards for his work, including Peabody, and has been named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Although my wife disagrees with the influential. It's the one thing I can't get her to recognize. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with everyone. I think obviously everyone who is here is because in some way connected to Lebanon, what is happening there. As someone who has covered Lebanon, I can say firsthand that it is one of, if not the most consequential countries in the Middle East because of all of the roads that intersect in Lebanon, both physically and metaphorically. So it's great to be here and to be a part of this conversation. Our speakers certainly need no introductions, but I'm going to introduce them anyway for everyone in the room. And then I think the nice thing of having such an intimate space is to be able to have a frank conversation. And I certainly know I'll be benefiting from it a lot more than probably anyone else, because then it'll shape my reporting, and hopefully the next time I am in Lebanon, I'll be able to kind of think about all of the insights that everyone here shares. I'll start off with Joseph Bahout, who is the director of the Institute for Policy and International Affairs, associate professor of politics, and who was also previously a researcher at the Carnegie Endowment and professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Also served as a consultant for the policy planning of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Former Ambassador Ed Gabriel, he was an ambassador to Morocco, currently serves on the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and of course is the president of the American Task Force on Lebanon. And Mona Yacoubian is the vice president for Middle East and North Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which of course was an independent, congressionally created institute back in 1984, headquartered in DC. She has worked on Lebanon throughout much of her career, including at USIP and previously at the U.S. Agency for International Development. So it's great to have all three of you with us. It's funny you asked me about Morocco for a second, so it kind of threw me for a loop, because everything that is happening in Morocco, we don't want to go off on a tangent, but what do you make of what's happening in Morocco right now?
Well, you know, it was a devastating blast. So many deaths. It's been difficult, but I must say the U.S. has responded quickly. The king has decided, you know, who he can bring in and how much he can bring in from the outside. I think he's moved very quickly now. But, you know, our prayers have to be off with them right now. It's difficult. And those villages were really hard hit in the Atlas, the Berber villages.
I've never been to Morocco, but is it those areas generally developed or underdeveloped?
Where the center of the earthquake was right in the middle of the mountains. And there are all these Berber villages in the sides of the mountains, and they were just crumbled. And then the blast hit the town of Agadir, the city of Agadir, and the city of Marrakesh. So there's a lot of potential destruction in those cities. But, you know, they're up and running again. Tourists are coming back in, believe it or not. But, you know, they need our help and support. And I think the world has turned.
Yeah, the images have been just heart-wrenching. With that, let's look at Lebanon. And it is certainly facing a lot of its own challenges. You know, usually in television, when you ask someone a very generic question, it's a sign that you don't know what you're talking about. So if you ever hear someone in television say, like, what's the latest or what's happening where you are, you just know that the anchor is pretty much checked out from the segment. But I feel like in Lebanon, that's actually a really good place to start, because it's like, yeah, exactly. Like, it's what in the world is going on in Lebanon? I don't know. That's actually a really tough question to answer when you're talking about Lebanon. So I thought maybe you could start with that kind of general overview, if you can give us a sense, Joseph, about like where you see Lebanon right now, both politically, economically. What is the landscape of the country?
Okay, thank you very much, Ayman, and thank you very much for the Debs Center. Thank you for you, Ada. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Tania. And thank you for being here. In fact, I'm very moved to be here because I've been hearing of this center, this office for a very long time. I'm a graduate from AUB and now in my position, so I'm very happy to be here. As you said, and also I'm very happy on a personal note, and very proud and glad and moved by the fact that my former professor at Sciences Po Paris and a longtime mentor of mine, Minister Hassan Salame, has very kindly wanted to attend this meeting. We'll try to keep it, as you said, informal, but at the same time broad and a little bit granular, and try to oscillate between the two. It's difficult to answer, as you said, in one or two sentences, a question like what's happening in Lebanon. So I'll try to take 2 or 3, let's say, hotspots that for me are today the most sensitive issues on the table, on the agenda, and then try to put some sense over that. I think the first and most prominent issue today on the table is the economic meltdown of the country. First of all, on a general note, I think we're talking about the country that is really now in a very dire situation, in a very critical state of coma. I know it's sometimes a bit strange to say it. I was telling Yara yesterday at dinner that I've written a paper some 15 years ago at Carnegie on Lebanon on the brink, and someone told me, but I mean, this country is constantly on the brink. It has always been on the brink, and this brink is never really realized. But today, I think we are really at a critical juncture. The economic meltdown first, very quickly. Without getting into details, you all know the situation in the country, the inflation, the devaluation, the poverty rates, everything social, etc. What I would say, to take a more macro view, I would say that what we in Lebanon call the shadow plan, that, let's put it very quickly, the oligarchy, political and financial and economic, has put in motion some 3 years ago, is today almost giving its final results. What is this shadow plan? It's first of all dissolving the huge losses of the depositors and the banks, something like $90 billion, dissolving them by lirification, by transforming them in a sort of zombie money, dollarizing the economy, multiplying exchange rates. A few months ago, we had 7 exchange rates in the country, which allowed a huge amount of arbitrages and a huge amount of benefits for politically privileged persons at all levels, with the impoverishment of society. In parallel to that, there was a sort of a very deliberate and very smart, I would say, cynically smart, kicking down the road and avoiding anything resembling the IMF package of reform, meaning capital control, bank secrecy law, forensic audit, bank restructuring. These are the 4 texts that are required by the IMF. They are still in the fridge. They are in parliament without any examination, without any progress. In the meantime, things are being solved a la Lebanese in a way. And in parallel to that, you have now the beginning, we start to see the nefarious impacts or the nefarious consequences of that on the macro structure, meaning a full cash economy. Almost 90% of the transactions are escaping the banking sector, so it's cash money. And with cash money, there is everything you know, meaning laundering of money, narco trafficking, etc., etc., and a zombie bank system. Banks are not working anymore. They are barely ATMs that give $400 a month for the average Lebanese. And the danger of that, I won't get further than that, the danger of that is that we are drifting towards a country that is soon to be a complete pariah of the international legal financial system, okay, will become a sort of non-financial actor on the international scene, unable to borrow, unable to exchange, unable to trade, etc., etc. What's next? If we go down this slope, I think in a few months now, the central bank will have no reserves. It will be zero. It means that the civil servants wouldn't be paid anymore. The army, soldiers, private officers, etc., wouldn't be paid anymore. Energy would not be paid. So we don't know how the country will function anymore. Then you have the last resort, which is the gold reserve of the country that probably will be sold. And after that, you find yourself completely naked. Now, of course, a very quick note, and here we often talked about that with Ed, there is now this new fantasy in Lebanon about the gas reserves, that the gas will pay it all, and etc. This is not only a very, let's say, shaky fantasy, because we still don't know what are we talking about, but it's a very dangerous fantasy, because in fact, it means that you will be completely vandalizing or cannibalizing anything that would be extracted from this gas to pay for things that are not really serving the economic growth and recovery of the country. So to stop to end on this first point, I would say that someone and something has to stop this very dangerous slope, and I'll come back to that in the conclusion. Second point, hotspot, the refugee issue. Okay, we talk about it a lot. It has become a few years ago in a meeting like that, I would have said, beware, this is becoming a time ticking bomb. Okay, today it is a bomb, and it has started to explode here and there. In which sense? In the sense of a very heated discourse, and in the sense of a very, let's say, unhealthy confrontation between facts and discourse and fantasies and reality. We still don't know what we are talking about. The official figure in Lebanon for Syrian refugees, a figure provided by the Director General of the Sûreté Générale, a supposedly very knowledgeable man, is 2.5 million. Everything we know, and we have Yara is the head of the refugee program at IFI. We have, I think, the best refugee program in the country. What we know is that the real figure is something like 1.8 million to the maximum. Okay, now, Syrians, regardless of this confrontation of figures, which is already a policy problem. You can't have a policy on something if you don't have, data. Regardless of that, it's impossible today to have a rational, serene, calm, constructive discussion within political forces and between Lebanon and the international donors and community on refugees. very quickly, I would say that we have to start breaking down this problem in terms of a sort of typology of who are these refugees. Of course, you have a real population of refugees. You have part of this population that are seasonal workers coming and going and back and forth from Lebanon and Syria. You have to treat them in a certain way. You have a part of the population of this population that is probably not refugees, so it has to be addressed in a way or another. And then you have the Lebanese particularity, a bunch of this population that are Syrian well-to-do people, part of the Syrian bourgeoisie that has fled the Syrian war, that has lost a lot of money in the collapse of the banking system, which is interesting because it shows also that the Syrian and Lebanese, let's say, fates are always intertwined, and we have to talk about this in a calm and serene way. The problem is that to talk about that, you need to have a closer and better and more accurate look at what's happening inside Syria, and we don't know it. You can't solve this issue if you don't have a dialogue with the Syrian authorities, but at the same time, for many reasons, it's not here the place to talk about them. You can't have this dialogue with the Syrian authorities, and the international community is not exactly playing the role of bridging the gap between the Lebanese, let's say, necessity and the Syrian constraint. And this is becoming increasingly complicated, especially in an international context. And here comes Ukraine, where you have also a bandwidth internationally that is not anymore amenable to the Lebanese, Syrian, Turkish, Jordanian issue of refugees. You have in Europe something like 6-7 million Ukrainian refugees, and the world is now turning its eye and its brain somewhere else. Quickly, the last point, the last hotspot, which is the domestic political situation, I would put it under a generic headline, which is Hezbollah, the elephant in the room. In fact, it's not anymore the elephant in the room, it's on the table. Here again, it is much more than a Lebanese question, like the Syrian refugee issue. It's a global, regional question. Hezbollah is a regional question, and we know it. Okay, it has to do with what's happening between US and Iran, between Saudi and Iran. These are things that escape the will and the capacity of the Lebanese. Okay, so we are on the receiving end. But however, at the same time, Hezbollah is a Lebanese question. The question is, and I think I'll conclude on that, talking about the presidential election. The question is, what would be the bargaining terms, the terms of the trade or the bargain for having a full integration of Hezbollah as a political party in the Lebanese institutions? This is the enigmatic question to which not only no one has an answer to, but no one wants to address the question and try to have an answer. No one wants to talk about that in a very lucid manner, in a very cold-blooded manner. Okay, what's the price of integrating this party completely in the Lebanese political system? It is in the Lebanese political system. It's probably above the Lebanese political system. But what would be the institutional, constitutional modifications, alterations, etc., put it as you wish, in order to solve this issue? And this is something that is today looming around and above the political, let's say, conundrum of the country. I think that if we have to find a glimpse of light there, we could say that maybe through the maritime delineation, the maritime border delineation lately, Hezbollah has shown a fair amount of pragmatism and the will to, besides or below or underneath a very aggressive discourse, to find solutions to problems. The hope is that this will apply also to the presidential election. I will conclude on that by saying that all these questions, and I very arbitrarily picked up 3 of them, I could have taken much more of them. Of course, we know that the presidential election, this is a country that is living in a vacuum today. The presidential election will not solve it all, we know it. But without this unavoidable lock or key, you cannot solve anything else. The hope is that within an international context where everybody is fatigued of Lebanon, I think that there's no bandwidth, and Minister Salami will probably confirm that no one today is really ready to put some energy, some political capital, some political attention to Lebanon because the international agenda is very crowded. There is the quintet, this group of 5 countries that are trying to find a solution to the presidential election. The hope is that at some point, the Lebanese dynamics and the international or regional dynamics of the quintet will converge and meet a matching point. But at that moment, it doesn't mean that all these difficult questions will be solved, but it will be probably time to start to lucidly and very pragmatically start to addressing them, knowing in advance that the prices to solve them will be extremely costly for Lebanese, and it will be a very long and bumpy road before we start to maybe start recovering this feeling. I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I was a bit long and probably very gloomy, but thank you.
Well, first of all, it was my fault because I gave you an open-ended question, but that's exactly why we wanted to give you that open-ended question. And then, I thought that weather was going to be the gloomiest thing I see today, but I guess that assessment was pretty gloomy. Ambassador Gabriel, I think maybe picking up on that point then, what is the perspective from Washington, D.C.? What is the international community that is looking at Lebanon, knowing that this is a country they cannot ignore for obvious reasons? If they ignore it, it will have severe implications on the region, US allies included. But at the same time, is it getting the resources, the attention, both diplomatically, economically, that it deserves from the international community?
Well, thank you, Ayman. Ada, Amanda, AUB, thank you for this opportunity to participate. Your question reminds me of a Tom Friedman.
Oh, no, that's.
Who said
This is like, I don't know if I should be insulted or.
The U.S. may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is surely interested in America. And I think that kind of captures what the U.S. policy is. There's a lack in strategy, but there's a lot of tactics. So there's a good and a bad element. We're not a tier 1 country. Lebanon is not. It's a tier 2 country. The priority is not as much as it should be, as you described. It's a serious country. It's not a tier 3 either, though. So there is kind of a strategic void by the United States when looking at a strategy towards Lebanon. Our objective, the U.S. objectives, are basically through the eyes of our policy with Iran and Israel. We don't have a Lebanon strategy, and that's very much needed. We can talk about that as we get into the day. But as Friedman would say, you're always drawn back in, and that's where I think America has done a good job. The Biden administration has really focused on responding to and reacting to opportunities, problems, issues to be solved. So more tactical approach, but a pretty robust one. The Lebanese Armed Forces are the only institution that's working in Lebanon, respected by the U.S. military, trusted by the Lebanese people. We're there, we're supporting them. Humanitarian aid is very important. Last year, the United States put $700 million into Lebanon. But this comes as a result of a very tough policy that the United States implemented, and that is with their allies, no more money to corrupt governments. We're not going to continue to throw international funds away. And we're going to sanction those who are against human rights, are corrupt, or harboring terrorism. Having said that, humanitarian aid then is important because Lebanese people suffer from such a tough policy. American education is very important in Lebanon. AUB, LAU, those are important aspects for us. Poverty rates are over 80%, feeding the poor. There's a food shortage among the extreme poor. There's services that are not being tended to that the Lebanese people need, basic services. We'll get into that, I think, as we talk through this. So humanitarian is important. We talked about sanctions. The maritime deal, that's a big deal. We got two enemies to sit down and demarcate the maritime border. which hopefully, there's nothing bad about that, in my opinion. It's all good. I do agree with Joe, though, and we can talk about this some more on the gas deal. Thank God they didn't find any gas yet or oil, because that money would have gone right out the back door. So there's a lot we need to talk about in that sense. But closing on the maritime border was another good Biden administration deal. And let me just say the last thing that I want to call out within my 3 minutes is we've got a strong diplomatic presence. The ambassador is really empowered to take decisions and make sure that they're in real time there. You know, and we need the ambassador there. Right now, we have a Senate that is holding up the confirmation process for so many of our U.S. ambassadors, and that's going to be a problem. You know, avoiding Lebanon is huge because stuff happens every day. Last couple of weeks ago, a truck of Hezbollah arms got tipped over. The ambassador had to be front and center with the Lebanese armed forces to make sure that the right things happen. You know, a charge, you know, a person that would fill in for an ambassador, they're going to write back to Washington and ask for instructions. By then it's too late. So I do want to call out the importance of that diplomatic approach, especially when it comes to trying to find a consensus on a president and a consensus on an IMF package. Congress is increasingly frustrated and demanding more action be taken with a strategy going against corrupt officials. And you'll see more and more action by Congress. They're really asserting themselves. And let me just say, all in all, though, when you think about this and all that's going on with Lebanon and the U.S. being a second-tier country, they're getting a lot of attention by U.S. policymakers, which I think Mona and I have talked about in the past. Is kind of surprising. I think part of that is because of the Lebanese diaspora, Lebanese American diaspora in the United States. It may be the only diaspora from the Arab world that's involved in the Middle East issues to this degree. Palestinians are too, of course. So with that, I'll stop, but I think that's kind of a look at U.S. policy.
Mona, can you give us the regional perspective? I mean, obviously the Middle East is changing rapidly, even just with the news today with the release of 5 American prisoners from Iran, $60 billion now in Qatari banks that Iran's going to be able to use, the talk of possible normalizations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Iraq is a mess. Syria is slowly kind of being brought back into the fold, I guess, more or less in some parts of the world. Turkey and Egypt. So all of that have implications, as the ambassador was saying, in terms of how the international community reacts with Lebanon. But what is the perspective from the neighborhood?
Thanks. Thank you, Ayman, and thanks to AUB and the Debs Center for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with such dear friends and esteemed colleagues. So can I say one word about Lebanon before getting to
You can say as many,
the one thing, and I fully agree with everything that both Joe and Ed have said, but I do think, but for the energy of the Lebanese diaspora, this is a country that I worry is always viewed as being on the brink, red lights flashing, and it has bred a sense of complacency, I think, in Washington, and dare I say, maybe among Lebanese and in the region. It's sort of the eternal, now deepening basket case. So I just want to plug that, because I think these efforts and seminars like this, webinars like this, are of critical importance to keep elevating it. You framed, I think, a lot about the Middle East that I think is interesting and in a way fascinating and possibly uplifting, which is I think the region is at a hinge moment and it's moving into a multipolar era that is characterized by the regional actors having far greater agency, seeking to solve their own problems, seeking to de-escalate conflict. So that's the good news. But to add to the gloom of the day, I think, we think of Lebanon. Lebanon is really extraordinary in terms of how significant and how deep this crisis is. The World Bank said one of the top 3 worst economic crises in 150 years or something. I mean, you can't exaggerate the significance of it. But it's also happening in the context of a region that sadly is characterized by what I would call almost a trifecta of challenges. One is poor governance, inadequate services, health, education, clean water. These, of course, were the challenges that gave rise to the Arab uprisings. Arguably, these were challenges very much in play at the time of 9/11. And that simply have not been addressed. We talked about, Ambassador Gabriel spoke about the earthquake in Morocco. And one of the issues that's come out, though, is the lack of government response to it, or the inadequate government response. We've had these catastrophic floods in Libya, 2 dams collapsed. We could talk more about this as we get into the climate issues, but there's clearly an overlay of climate change but in this case, poor governance, because those dams were not well maintained. And you have now a catastrophe in Libya. You have poor governance, you have economic collapse in many countries. Lebanon is but one, Egypt, Tunisia, both in the throes of various stages of some sort of IMF bailout, anemic private sectors across the region, very poorly integrated. The Middle East, North Africa is the least integrated region of the world, which again, I think that's low-hanging fruit for opportunity, but it certainly hasn't been resolved. And pervasive corruption, which again, I think Lebanon is a poster child, maybe. If we look at, for example, the port explosion, and I mean, I can't think of a more egregious example of public malfeasance than that. But it's in good company, and it's across the region, right? Iraq, Egypt, the Gulf. It's everywhere. And then add to that those 3, the presence of conflict. Right, this is a conflict-ridden region, and it has left in its wake enormous humanitarian suffering. The worst humanitarian crisis in the world is in Yemen. So that's where that's the context in which all of this is happening. And then if we look at Syria, which we touched on, I think that this is where I think Lebanon, the example of Lebanon and the intertwining of Lebanon and Syria is really evident. So at some point, a well-known Syrian economist described Lebanon as the lung through which Syria breathes. And now the lung has collapsed. And we are seeing a collapse in Syria. Let me back up and be clear. This is a country that's now in its 13th year of conflict. It's ruled by a brutal dictator. And it has its own economy has, I think the Syrian pound has depreciated something like 80% in the last 2 or 3 months. That leads to enormous poverty rates. 90% of Syrians live below the poverty line. Enormous need. I think 85% of Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance at a time when humanitarian budgets are shrinking. And so, to me, I think it's a dramatic example of how what happens in Lebanon doesn't stay in Lebanon, how the region is interconnected for good or for ill. And right now, I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, is sort of a reverberating out of Lebanon's crisis, most dramatically in Syria, but again, also because of conflict, brutal corruption in Syria, et cetera. And so I think it leaves us, I think, with very significant challenges to think about, but I would argue they're also eminently resolvable.
Can I come back to something that you said earlier about solving the presidential issue is not going to solve all of Lebanon's problems, but certainly could be the first step in creating some momentum? How do you begin to solve the presidential question in Lebanon without fundamentally trying to reconstitute, if you will, the state of Lebanese politics, not just politics in the kind of classic sense of party and factions, but the actual institution, the way the system was designed that brought peace in the first place, to move away from a confessional system and perhaps try to reconstitute the executive branch in Lebanon?
It's a bit of chicken and egg problem, or equation. Should you wait for something to be repaired in the Lebanese, let's say, machine or apparatus in order to have a president, or should you have a president in order to put in motion whatever is needed to repair the Lebanese game? I think it's both. Now, as I said, maybe it's a different way to answer your question. As I said, I think that what is today at stake, and I think now exactly probably somewhere in the corridors of the UN building, there are talks about that between the Qataris, the Saudis, the French, the Americans, the Egyptians, maybe the Iranians behind some wall or something. You need to find at one point a convergence between this regional dynamic, this regional and international dynamic, and I'll say a few words about the terms of the equation and the Lebanese, the regional and international, let's say, dynamics towards Lebanon, and the local, the domestic dynamics or lack thereof, because I don't know if there's a dynamic, but there is one. Now, very quickly, and you know it, where we are stuck in terms of presidential conundrum today is that each camp, quote unquote, has their own candidate, and each camp is unable to impose their candidate to the other camp. This is political, arithmetic, regional, local, etc., etc. The question today, and this is the challenge, but somewhere it's a sort of false challenge, because we all know that the film will end, ultimately will close on looking for the third man. This would be the title of the film. Okay? We all know that we're heading
A great title.
looking for the third man or woman. In that sense, in that case, I think it would be
Person.
but the problem is that it's taking too much time. Within this time that is lost, things are unraveling. I said it already, for example, on the economic issue. Let me just give you one figure. The central bank today, what's remaining in the central bank coffers is something like $6 billion. At the rhythm and the pace of the necessary spending that Lebanon has to do, this means that you still have 4 or 5 months maximum of things to spend on, I mean, prime necessity things, electricity, wheat, salaries, etc. And so the time is becoming of the essence completely. So the problem is that we all know that we're heading towards this consensus. Time is now running against you. Now, what is this consensus about? I think that, and this is maybe where, Mona, maybe, I want to be optimistic, which is not in my nature, as you know, maybe some of the regional dynamics would help you. The Iranian-Saudi rapprochement or something, I still don't know how to call it, by the way. The Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, what happened yesterday between Iran and the US, maybe there was an addenda that, okay, let's solve certain issues of the region, I'm not sure. But however, on the other side, you have things that are unraveling in the bad side, in the bad direction. For example, the conflict between Iran and the US on Syria is giving signs of becoming more intense with the closing of the border between Syria and Iraq. In Yemen, I don't know if there are progresses made, and etc. But you can use this kind of momentum in order to say, okay, let's start to, or let's try at least to build a sort of confidence building scenario in Lebanon by choosing someone that is accepted by both camps. On the Lebanese side of the equation, or the conundrum, I think that even Hezbollah, and this is maybe a risky hypothesis that I would make, even Hezbollah knows for many reasons that the candidate that they are proclaiming is theirs, and they are not ready to move an inch out of this candidate, is not an optimal solution for them. It's not that they can't bring him to power, but even if they bring him, this solution is not a solution, not for the country, because I don't think they care, them and others, about the country, but for them in the country. So this is where you can find a sort of the glimpse, a certain glimpse of light or optimism by saying that ultimately, and this is where the brink, I'm sorry, again, has a sort of utility. Everybody is now starting to be a bit afraid of the depth of the brink. So maybe at some point you can bring everybody one step behind and say, okay, let's find the least bad solution. And we know what's the least bad solution is, the third man. Now, okay,
Third
we can,
person.
the third person, okay, we can diverge on the name, the third person, but I'm almost sure that we're heading this way. Now, here we get into the intricacies of the quintet and etc. I think the French initiative, to put it very bluntly, has failed. Okay, I think it's over. Now remains to find a face-saving, maybe exit for the French on that, but this is findable. I mean, it could be found. I think now probably we will see a phase 2 of this quintet initiative with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Americans taking the lead. And this is where probably a real bargain, a tough one, a costly one, a difficult one will start to take place with the Iranians, embodied in Lebanon by Hezbollah, in order to find the right price for reaching the solution of the third person.
May I just underscore what you just said? I would really suggest that this Quint group, United States, Qatar, Saudi, Egypt, and France, could be a solution. The French, the French came out with some bad ideas. They gave all the parties a homework assignment. And they said, gee, tell us what the ideal president should look like. You got to get to the nut cutting. There are names out there, third person names, that they need to start meeting on. And I think the United States, we've got indications that the US, Saudi and Qatar and Egypt have come together, reeled in the French. So just to create a little bit of optimism, I think there's something going on right now to bring the parties together and look at a third candidate, hopefully.
Now, let me add one thing to what Ed said. Finding the third candidate, I think, wouldn't be, of course, enough, as you said, but it should also be paralleled with, let's say, drawing the contours of a roadmap for the 2 coming next years on the issues that I've mentioned, the economic collapse, the refugee issue, and the institutional, let's say, deadlock. If there is no, at least minimal roadmap or the skeleton of a roadmap for that, even finding the third person would, of course, stop probably the very steep slope on which we are, but it would be really insufficient.
Can I ask on that point, you know Lebanon much better than I do, but from the Lebanese people that I speak to, certainly young Lebanese who live in a post-Civil War, post kind of sectarian sense of identity, who want jobs, who want opportunity, who want to get out of Lebanon when the situation is getting bad, not necessarily as beholden to these very strong identity markers of Lebanese politics as, let's say, their parents and grandparents. But unfortunately, it is their parents and grandparents who are making the decisions about Lebanon right now. How do you begin to change that dynamic, or do you just have to accept that reality and play within it? Because you speak to young Lebanese people and they want to move away from how the country is currently governed politically. They want to move to a post-confessional system.
Right.
But the truth is you can't do that because of the reasons that Joseph just mentioned.
No, I think you framed it really well, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the movement, the Delaware movement in 2019 and what that looked like, which was quite astounding and exciting, right? It was cross-confessional, it was all up and down the country, it was women, students, and it was really about a national identity for the country of Lebanon. And to me, it embodied everything that is so incredible about Lebanon. The creativity, the entrepreneurialism, the hope that that generation in particular embodies. We know what, we don't have to rehash all the terrible things that have happened since. But what I would say is, I don't think there's the luxury to do one or the other. I mean, I'm very mindful and very much agree with the constraints that have been raised. And you can't simply undo something and have nothing else to fill in. That being said, there's all kinds of things that can be done at the local level, that can be done to empower civil society and civil society actors. I mean, Lebanon has actually had, I think, a rather disturbing trend toward more infringements on freedom of speech and so forth. Again, we can't be complacent. I worked at AID for 3 years in the period 2014 to 2017. Our focus was always at the local level, and that was really for 3 reasons. One, the central government was dysfunctional at best. Two, it's at the local level where action happens. Like that's where I used to say, this is where rubber hits the road. Like, this is where stuff is going on. And there's a vested interest in making things work. And three, you would see the most, as a result of that, you'd see the most creative problem solving happening at that local level. And I know that there are folks around the table who know this far better than me, folks that are living in Lebanon, who see every day these sort of glimpses of creative problem solving and creative solutions. I think it's incumbent, frankly, on all of us at the table, on the Lebanese American diaspora, on my own US government, to really shift the paradigm and think much more creatively about what do we do to catalyze the problem solvers? How do we help? And this should be multi-stakeholder, this should be private sector, this should be civil society, this should be education, this should be AUB, and others. And it, to me, it's emblematic of honestly something I would be recommending more broadly for the Arab world and as an American, which is really the United States needs to up its soft power. That we've really, that our soft power, our ideals, what it is that Americans brought to the region, atrophied, in my view, in the last 2 decades in particular, that were really shaped by big footprint military interventions, counterterrorism, securitized approach, and a lens that really didn't understand the region. And you see where it is. Not that it's the Americans that are going to solve this, not at all.
It's empowering the locals to try to solve.
Absolutely. It's catalyzing and empowering organic elements that are looking for change, not by looking through a security lens, but rather by bringing the best of what America has to offer with respect to our soft power, our diplomacy, our peace building, which is far and away, in my view, if it's you know, energized, is far and away the best in the world.
Can I push back on that just to say, what are some of those specific solutions that you would see? I mean, I think, you know, on a macro level, I think we all agree that is a better approach.
Yeah.
But how do you solve some of the issues that you have outlined, whether it is the local economic challenges? How do you create more accountability so when there is a port blast, people lose their lives, there is some semblance of justice?
Well,
they're
right.
tough issues to do on a local level.
They are. I think for the US, it's about prioritizing those issues and frankly, putting a lot of more diplomatic capital into those kinds of questions. And secondly, it's going to require creativity on our part, on the US's part. As I said at the beginning here, I think those tools have atrophied. I mean, the American University of Beirut is probably one of the most powerful examples of American soft power in the world, I would. And
Your
it's
father went.
my father, the son of refugees.
Yeah.
And a cab driver went there. And here I am,
Yeah.
born in the States, but my ties to Lebanon are so deep. And so you can see how enduring it is.
Sure.
And we've sort of lost that. And so, you know, I don't have all the answers for you, Ayman.
Yeah.
I actually think that's where we all need to go.
Please.
Let me add to this, great ideas, Mona. Let me just pick off a few ideas like energy, electricity. You can put in solar projects into villages very easily, and they can be cost effective. You can get a private sector investment fund so that you could double, triple the seed monies the United States government may put into such a thing. So we could really branch out and deal with water treatment and electricity. Education, 60% of the school's budget is electricity. So now you're solving another problem. And maybe some priority should be given to those villages that are impacted by Syrian refugees. So you can see a lot of these things coming together at the local level. Citizen groups could be formed to help interact with the local government on what the priorities should be, et cetera. This was done in Morocco, but in that case, the king was behind it because he saw the central government not working. In this case, it has to be a bottom-up approach, and it's going to take US leadership to really jawbone for those kinds of projects.
Before we get into energy, you want to say, I want to ask you about natural gas, but go ahead.
No, in fact, my atavic nature is getting back, so I would like to put a note of pessimism here and play a little bit of that advocate on two issues. It's important because I agree with both of you, but we have to be aware of certain things also. 2 points on that note. The question of new generations and etc., a better, let's say, sense of citizenship, more, national identity driven. Yes. However, there are things in the new generations also that could be sometimes, let's say, worrying. We both teach, Tania and I, at the UB, we live in Lebanon. You also have a new generation that is maybe could be tempted by a new sort of radicalism that has led to the war in 75. And this is due partly to the deep failure of the state. People don't believe anymore in something that is common, a common project in the country. The voices about divorcing, and you could hear this every day on TV, the voices claiming, and I'm not talking only about, for example, the Christian society or the Christian, let's say, segments of society, but you could hear it here and there that this country is not livable anymore. The social pact, the social contract is broken irremediably. Let's find something else. I've lived through the war. I've never heard since discourses about divorce, federalism, partition, and etc. as the ones that I'm hearing today, even in some circles at the UB and etc. that are supposed to be enlightened. In parallel to that, so this is a call for, or at least a sort of disillusionment with the Lebanese social contract. In parallel to that, and you mentioned the Thawra movement, you have also, it's been 4 years now, you have a drift towards apathy. You have a lot of people who are not anymore believing or even tempted to go in the public space. They say, okay, all this is vain. We have had elections, we have had chances to topple the system, etc. It led nowhere. Let me retrench either towards emigration, and you have a huge brain drain today, and we are suffering from it at the university. I'm the director of a center where my main problem is today finding human resources. It's not finding financing or funding. It's to find people who are able to do some work, or they are retrenching in their private sphere. Social media, staying at home, etc., which is a very dangerous slope. So the society is today polarized between people who are tempted by radical solutions, completely irrational, but they will take their chance to try them, or people who are saying we don't want to listen or to hear. This is the first point. So the bemol, or at least the caveat I would put on the new generation. Second caveat on the issue of local dynamics, decentralization of solutions, etc. I'm very much for it. I'm a big proponent and advocate of that. However, the risk, and USAID, AFD, GIZ have tried it. The risk is that saying, okay, I want to circumvent the state because it's corrupt, it's inefficient, and etc. I will work with civil society. First of all, you are creating a sort of parallel society of NGOs. Second, the risk is that you are let's say, defeating your purpose as international actors, which is to construct or reconstruct a state apparatus. I'll take the example of the solar panels.
A lot of words.
The solar panels, for example, we've done a study on solar panels. Today, almost 70% of Lebanon, 70% of Lebanon is lit through solar energy, etc. What is the result today? No one is talking anymore about the reform of electricity, which was the prominent headline 2 years ago.
Right.
And this is a crucial part of the economic reform. Today, everybody is telling you in Lebanon, I don't care about electricity. Don't reform it. I don't want to hear about it. I have my solar panels. I'm autonomous, etc. This is good.
Yeah.
It's fine because it allows people to function. But in the meantime, you are emptying the state system, the state
Of authority
apparatus,
of
the
all.
state administration.
The only thing I'd
And this
say,
is the risk.
Yeah.
the only thing I'd say, Joe, I don't disagree with what any of your characterization, but what I'm saying, it's not an either or proposition.
Sure.
You've got to do both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And USA is very, very aware of what you just said, but they're also not gonna, we have laws about where our money goes, where
Yeah.
US government money goes, and they simply cannot put it there. So it's not to forsake these issues,
Yeah.
but it's actually to save them. Because at the rate things are going now, where you're in this moment of stagnation and stalemate, you're absolutely right. We're seeing Lebanon change before our eyes, right? The demography of the country is changing.
And we have to help the people.
Say it again.
And we have to help the people.
And we have to,
Yeah, I agree.
absolutely, and so, and what I see as exciting though, is I do see a paradigm shift in the region, as I said, and a move toward problem solving and de-escalation. And what I would urge and what I will certainly work for is a paradigm shift here at home, here in DC, here in Washington, here in New York, wherever we are, where we have a better, and frankly, more appropriate approach to the region.
Do you wanna, you can weigh in on whatever you want, cause
Why
I,
don't we segue to the gas stuff? And,
Sure.
I might say one word about electricity.
sure, so I guess that I wanna go back to what you said in your opening remarks about, luckily they did not, there is no gas as of now. I mean, the delineation was important, but now the next question is what happens, if they do find gas and how that is going to be. What do you think it's going to be? Is it a fantasy? Is it going to be a poisonous pill? How would the discovery of gas and actual production of it help or hurt Lebanon?
So, Ayman, obviously, if it's done right, it could be very helpful to the country. King Mohammed of Morocco once said, maybe I'm blessed that we don't have oil because we had to reach deep inside and dig for our own other capabilities. Look, first of all, there's no substitute for IMF reforms through this process. Anything that comes out of this development should be put into a sovereign fund. It shouldn't be going to the government budget so it can go out the back door to non-productive sectors. So that's number one. People have to understand this is not a substitute for IMF reforms. Number two, it's going to take multiple years to find out where we are in this development. One well does not make for OPEC members. And that's what you're hearing in Lebanon. So they do have an exploration. Total is involved with the Qataris. What we're hearing is that there may be some worry about whether or not that oil and gas has migrated to other places. So we don't know if it's in commercial quantities yet. And then if they get, a couple of factors that make sense through seismic and through this first exploration, then they got to start to punch holes for a couple more years. $50 to $70 million a well. So if they don't strike it on this one, they're walking. They won't put another 70 million in. So this is a long process of exploration that hopefully may come to fruition. But then you get to a sovereign fund. You've got to, in the meantime now, work on an independent sovereign fund that takes the money in and uses it for development purposes. Can we put $1 for every 10 that we get from the private sector for XYZ project? So that's the kind of process I think. Let me just say one other thing. A law was passed quietly in Lebanon that you got to have a Lebanese partner on these deals. Gee, I wonder what that means. I think it should be brought out that they shouldn't have farmed in partners from Lebanon like this. They're going to get their 10%. I think that we should, the Americans should really lead in that effort. And there are international best practices. World Bank has them, et cetera. We've got to take those best practices and try to educate Lebanon on those. So hopefully one day, 10 years from now, maybe, but it's not part of the budget process. And right now they've got to service a budget and they got to help their people. And that's not going to do it.
Do you have anything you'd like to say, Joe, about
Yeah,
the,
on this, no, I
just about the natural gas part of it?
completely agree with
Yeah.
Ed. First of all, it's a very long-term, it's a very long-term process. According to what I've read, it's for now, it's 6 months to 1 year of exploration of, trying to see if there is gas. After that, it's 1 year to know how much gas is there, and then you have 4 to 5 years to start drilling, extracting, etc. Which means that by that time, you have to know where is the gas market, the market and the prices. It could be completely something else. Second, you have to solve your electricity problem in the meantime, and you can't say, yes, we will solve it because we are going to extract gas. And also, as Ed said, you can't say we will wait in order to solve the economic issue because we are having gas. Let me give you 2 examples. A very prominent banker, very prominent banker, one of the top 5, was on TV 2 months ago. The anchorman told him, okay, how are you thinking about solving the depositors problem? Giving back $80 billion to Lebanese who lost all their money in the bank. He said, very easy, the gas will do it. Okay, he asked him, how much do you estimate the gas revenues? He said, plainly, and this guy has a PhD in economics and is a serious banker. He said $300 billion. Where the heck did he bring this figure from? At maximum, it's 10 millions or something. So if these people, if he is convinced about that, this is a problem. If he is not convinced about that, this is also a problem because they are building a very shadowy recovery plan based on something completely inexistent. Second thing, you mentioned the Lebanese counterparts. The Lebanese, the law requires a Lebanese counterpart. Grossly speaking, today, there are something between 70 and 90 companies that have been created abroad from Lebanese in order to second that. 80% of them are directly linked to political personnel. So the theft has already started.
Let me bring it back for a second to something I think everyone should feel good about, which is, let's take the gas deals out of the picture for a moment, but the negotiation of a permanent maritime border between Israel and Lebanon. The US was these, again, I don't want to be a cheerleader for the United States, but I do think this is an example of US diplomacy, creative diplomacy at its best, where the special envoy Amos Hochstein was, persistent, committed, and was able to pull this deal together in a way that I think decreases the potential for conflict. I'm not saying that there's none, but it absolutely decreases it. And it was creative diplomacy that brought together really interesting stakeholders, including private sector, Total, certainly various Lebanese elements. There's certainly the piece about Hezbollah, which actually demonstrated an element of pragmatism, understanding that they didn't want to be called out for standing between this deal, Lebanon and this deal. So I think it is important to just, let's take a step back and see what happens when, in particular, the US puts a lot of its capital into diplomacy and seeks to find creative solutions.
It's opened the door also for the land border talks now.
So I was just gonna, and I'm gonna finish on this point before we open it up for the audience for questions, but it's almost impossible to talk about Lebanon without talking about security, and you can't talk about security without talking about the situation on the southern border. And since that was brought up, I thought we can just spend a minute on that, because so much of the security situation in Lebanon is actually based on what's happening outside of Lebanon, America, Iran, Israel, and now with the last round of what we saw, what appears to be the presence of Palestinian factions in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, willing to try and go around Hezbollah, but try to draw Lebanon into a direct confrontation with Israel. So this is just more of a, what are your thoughts on how that situation is right now, and how precarious of a situation Lebanon is on the security front?
I'll just say a word and I'll defer to my colleagues, but I think the word precarious is exactly where I was going. You cannot overestimate how precarious it is. And I think you're right to point out that Lebanon, sadly, is not just an independent actor. It is being acted upon by others. And I think we can't ignore what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians, between all of the disruption that's going on in Israel domestically, as well as a much more hardline government there, and the ways in which, what I would argue, that this is where the absence of a state in Lebanon is so dangerous, right? And again, my view is, rather than looking at Hezbollah solely through a security lens, let's understand that Hezbollah thrives on chaos. It thrives in an environment of weak state institutions, and therefore it's critical to invest in and build those up. I would be curious what my colleagues think. I'm not so sure how far along Lebanon and Israel will get with respect to a land border. I think that's going to be far more difficult, but at least that those discussions are in there, and you've got to try it is important.
And let me just add to what you're saying. Neither side wants war, in my opinion. I think they would like to avoid it at all costs. Part of the reason why the maritime border went through is Hezbollah didn't want to be confronted with, having to put their fists behind their mouth, if you will. And so I don't think neither side wants it. However, one false move could escalate it into a war. And that's where American diplomacy and leadership is so important. And it gets back to that strategy. What is our position in terms of a strategy for Lebanon? And should it, we be on the front line trying to deal with that possibility? That's why we need an ambassador as well.
I agree that the deal has probably neutralized the border. Now you have a lot of vociferation here and there, and it will go on, but I think a full-fledged confrontation is to be excluded. This is the importance of the deal. It has created a mutually beneficial, let's say, equation. Both parties want to explore, extract, etc. However, I think today, if I have to rank the risks of security, let's say, dangers for Lebanon, I would say the worst case scenario would be, if we stay in this vacuum, repeated incident on a societal level of insecurity, meaning people robbing banks, closing roads, burning tires, etc., because of poverty, because of duress, etc. At one point, this could be easily grafted on some more macro communitarian, sectarian security incident. The Kahale incident is one case in point. It could involve, I'm making a doomsday scenario here. It could involve some pockets of fragility, vulnerability, like Syrian refugee camps, Palestinian refugees, and at that moment, it will spiral out of control. In parallel to that, you have a Lebanese armed force that is extremely overstretched physically, extremely tired morally and financially. One figure, today the officer in the Lebanese army is earning $60 a month. And without the aid, the cash aid by Qatar and the US, they cannot meet, they cannot make their ends meet at the end of the month. They can't put anything on the table for their families. At that point, if they are faced with such an unraveling of domestic security or unsecurity, I'm not seeing the troop able to respond properly to such a danger. And this is where the security is going, not on the border. I don't think we will see an incident on the border between Lebanon and
I feel like I wish we could have ended on a slightly happier note. We certainly tried, but such is the discourse on Lebanon these days. I think we can open the conversation up to questions or comments, and we can go from there. If you don't mind just introducing yourself. And
I'm Chris Aiken. I'm at Princeton. I taught at AUB in June, American politics. And my students were intensely interested in federalism and pressed me on how American federalism works and alternate schemes for themselves and so on. What do you all think?
So I have an opinion. I think the three of us do on this. It's federalism can mean separation of religions. And so you've got to be very careful.
Sorry, it can or can't? I didn't hear.
It can.
it can
lead
mean
to a
separate,
separate.
oh, it can lead to
Yeah,
separation
you
of
know,
religion.
there's a canton for Maronites, a canton for
Yes.
Right.
Sunnis, et cetera. So I think it's better to think about local empowerment and decentralization with villages and stay away from these big talks, because the people proposing federalism are really proposing about cutting themselves loose
Yeah.
from other religions. So
It's a
it's a
code
very,
word for
Yeah.
partition.
Yeah, exactly. Can I just say, I think Ed has got it just exactly right. I think it's a false comparison to raise the American example with what those that are in Lebanon are proposing, precisely because the intention is completely different. And it's also such a small country that really, in my view, cannot sustain that. And let's also look at Iraq and you know, Iraq's experiment with terrorism, which has been troubled, to say the least.
In fact, because the solution, or at least the main proponents for federalism in Lebanon are proposing it not from a functional point of view, not saying, okay, let's see how to solve the policy problems, but it's an identity-based debate.
exactly.
And this is why it's dangerous, because it will lead, without any doubt, to a sort of centrifugal dynamic that will, at one point, break out the country completely. And it won't break out without a war. I mean, it will not be a divorce a la Czechoslovak with really, you know, sitting in front of a lawyer and doing things properly. It will be bloody.
Hi, my name is Rima Zaitoun. I'm a graduate of AUB, and I spent 3 months, and I currently actually I'm VP for Global Advancement for Lebanese American University. I spent 3 months in Lebanon this summer, and I totally agree with everything you said, but I have to make some comments. First thing, the Syrian refugee crisis is a huge problem for Lebanon. They live better than the Lebanese people are living. They get free medical care, free education, they get stipends, and the Lebanese people are really struggling. And I'm not saying, not because I don't care for refugees, I do, but I think the Lebanese people are paying a huge price for the presence of the Syrian refugees, and before that, for the Palestinian refugees. So my thinking is there a way where we can shift the incentives for the Syrians to start returning home by giving them, you know, benefits to go back home? And because most jobs at the menial level in Lebanon are taken over by Syrians, even, you know, the hairdresser, agriculture, you know, so it's all Syrian taking the jobs of Lebanese. I know maybe Lebanese don't want to do these jobs, but I think at this point they're really desperate. In terms of security, I think Lebanon is critical because it's on the northern border of Israel, and I think I'm surprised that the United States is not really enforcing stability in Lebanon for Israel's sake and that part of the world. And my fear as a Lebanese who's witnessed politics in Lebanon this summer is they're really crippling the Lebanese political system. So Hezbollah, because Shiite, and Syria being led by a Shiite dictator, that there is more interest in the collapse of Lebanon to take care, because it's very religious in our area, you know, Sunni and, you know, Maronites and Greek Orthodox, whatever. But I really feel that that's the way it's going, that Lebanese people, Lebanon will be obliterated as a country down the road because it's in total collapse. Total collapse. That's my 2 cents from having lived there after having left Lebanon for 37 years. So I experienced it firsthand. And I do feel for the Lebanese people because they wanna try to create in different villages like Zahli. They have their own electrical power plant. They're doing well, but I understand there's conflict there. But I do see as a Lebanese, if I have to live there and not be able to have access to clean water, you know, electricity, but also the Syrian refugees, they're taking away the use of water, electricity. That's another problem in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So I think there's so many issues interplay, but I think, you know, that's my
yeah,
2
like,
cents.
No, and very important 2 cents. I mean, that's a perspective certainly that is being shared among others in Lebanon on many different fronts. There is a resentment that is building up towards the Syrian refugees, and not say that you resent them. You obviously know you don't, but I can understand why Lebanese
I feel
citizens are.
sorry for the Lebanese.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, Ayman, the situation with the Syrian refugees in Lebanon is unsustainable, period. Unfortunately, right now, under the Assad regime, they can't go back to Syria under international law. So that starts to put us in a box. The American Task Force on Lebanon has put together a study group, UNHCR, several people around this table, and World Bank, IMF, other organizations to address this problem. If with those givens that I just mentioned, we've got to come up with some very creative solutions and put some of this pressure back on the international community to deal with. Now, on the facts of that, you said, you know, different facts about the refugees. Part of the study is going to tell the truth about the facts. You know, who's suffering where on education or health or crime rates, or who's going back and forth, who's a refugee or not. We hope to get after some of this and in the months ahead deal with it. On the security question, I would just say, Rima, maybe I see it differently. I think that the unbelievable negotiation by Amos Hochstein to bring two enemies together and work on that border was a big step forward. To talk about the land border now is important. And remember, UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping group there, has kept the peace for nearly 20 years. So I think we're engaged, more to do. I get your point. It's about Hezbollah, your point is, and there's only so much we can do without creating another civil war.
Any other questions or?
No, please, no. Well, we're both from NGO Committee on Status of Women and our concerns of human rights and gender equality. And it really does break our hearts because for us, Lebanon has been a lifeline in reaching Middle East in so many ways because of AUB, because of activists on the ground. And what concerns me the most is this fundamentalism on the far right, because, you know, Middle East is literally a dark hole for us because we talk regionally from the global center here, and it's always been difficult to reach Middle East to begin with, and then to see Lebanon integrating is really hard. But the one thing that I am walking away, and I have to really figure out how to amplify this, is the catalyze the problem solvers is really what I'm taking away from this meeting, because it is a local and the global, right? I mean, there are solutions out there, but how do we really reach the students and the young people to hear that even in AUB, there are mentalities who are pulling away from human rights is really disheartening. So I feel like the only reason I want to speak up is like, Lebanon is also one of those situations. I'm also Armenian, so both of my countries are in trouble right now, so please don't bring up doom again. I can't survive, and I'm supposed to do human rights work. But I say that about both countries a lot of times when I'm arguing, is that it's really the little engine that could. I think there's such an opportunity to show how a small country with the right attitude, with the right movements, like the 2019 movement, you know, we can't dismiss those. We got to figure out a way to just, you know, bring them back up.
Did you want to say something?
Not if it's doom. I will.
No.
Sorry, with all due respect.
No, I quick answer. I mean, when I hear you, what I think about is that, in fact, actually, if you take the entire region and the world, there is lately a sort of, and this is echoing in Lebanon and elsewhere, you have a drift, or at least the rise of a new counterculture internationally of, call it, I mean, neo-conservative, neo-authoritarian, neo-populist, neo-etc. That is not liberal.
Yeah.
And in Lebanon and in the region, the liberal forces are eroding. Middle class, liberal thought, etc. It is eroding, and this is why you have this, I think, this danger for people like what AUB is embodying, for example, a liberal thought, a progressive thought, human rights oriented, etc. This is today very much challenged by, first of all, a discourse, an intellectual discourse elsewhere in the world, and what's happening in Ukraine is an example, and Russia, etc. But also because of the erosion, the economic and social erosion of the classes that could have borne this sort of discourse. And this is where we're not talking only ideology and culture, we're talking about things that are very, as you said, that are very concrete. How are people living in this country? With what? What do they have to put in their plate at the end of the day? And this is, I think, you can't separate that from a sort of drift towards a discourse that is increasingly intolerant.
I feel compelled to say something as someone who's half Lebanese and half Armenian. And you can't, you must, I think, with that history, particularly at the Armenian side, you must hold on to hope because it's essential. And with due respect to Joe, I fully agree. And we all know democratic backsliding, authoritarianism, all of that, absolutely. But there are other forces at play that are, to my mind, actually quite. They make me feel optimistic, and it is indeed this idea of agency, of the diffusion of power, of a desire to de-escalate conflict. I think the region is done with conflict. I really do. Call me an idealist. Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
You mean they're done with it in the sense like there won't be another conflict, or they're just tired of
I
it?
think there is a fatigue
Of conflict, yeah, for sure.
conflict.
Yeah. I don't think a region. I
No
don't
one's
think a
ever
region.
done with conflict, okay?
No, I meant to say like I don't think there's a region that seeks conflict as.
No, and this has been a region, sadly, where lots of conflicts have been played out.
Yeah.
And I do think that the Saudi-Iran rapprochement and other things, the normalization, we could pick it apart, and there are all kinds of agendas at play. I'm not naive.
Yeah.
But I do think the region is fatigued by conflict. And I think there's a desire to solve problems. Where do you start? You start where you start small. And that's, I mean, there was the idea, the theme of local empowerment is, to me, important, and one that all of us need to look and see where we find those places that we can catalyze the creative problems.
We have about 5 minutes left, and then maybe 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, it's totally fine.
Can I add just one little thing?
Please.
All the youth that is leaving Lebanon is not gonna go back. I know they're really building lives outside Lebanon, and there's a real crisis coming up where it's an aging population in Lebanon. The youth that haven't left is because they couldn't. They're trying their best to leave.
Yeah.
And that's gonna be another problem for Lebanon. Aging population without the proper medical care facilities. So that's also another issue to have to look after in the future.
No, it's a very important point. And speaking of the future, though, I want to ask something about America here, specifically with Lebanon, and maybe both of you can comment on that. There has been in the last couple of years, broadly speaking, in the region, a push away from America. I mean, America is still very much involved in the Middle East, but I think some of it is by our own doing, with President Obama wanting to pivot to Asia, with saying like we need to close the book on the Iraq War and move away from it. So there is also, America has a fatigue of the Middle East. Policymakers at least certainly express that. So do you think some of these things changing in the Middle East, these shifts, the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, the desire for other countries perhaps to flex a little bit, is because America has been a little bit disengaged, and as a result, maybe there are opportunities absent of America's involvement?
Without a doubt. I mean, I would argue that's probably been one of the prime drivers, is its reception by the region, that the US is actually, what we've been doing is putting them in the crosshairs of conflict, primarily with Iran. And we're not there when the rubber hits the road, to use that phrase again. So the attack in Abqaiq, I think, was a seminal watershed moment for the Gulf.
Yeah.
Where they suffered a pretty significant attack and there was no US response.
Yeah.
And so I think they've made the calculus that we're not there, or we're not going to be there, and they need to start solving their problems on their own. I actually think there's a piece of that that's quite healthy. It's fascinating to me that not once yet, in however long we've been talking, has the word China been mentioned. And
Or
yet
Russia.
or Russia, let's not.
I'm not.
China, I mean, I actually think what I would hope, look, China is clearly playing far more of a role. They're broadening their engagement in the region well beyond what they have been doing to a strategic role. They view themselves as sort of emblematic of the global south. They want to mediate conflicts, etc. And the argument I am making, and I think others in Washington, is look, if we want to compete with China in the Middle East, it's not going to be on a war footing. It's going to be catalyzing creative problem solvers. It's going to be coming in with the best of what the Americans have to offer with respect to resolving conflict. Amos's role with Israel, Lebanon, but one of the Chinese couldn't have done that for a million years. So yes, I think it is absolutely in response to a perception that the US is pulling out. And I would argue in a way it's healthy and good for the region. And now it's back on the US to look at this, understand what it is and engage in a healthy.
It needs to engage, yeah.
We have just 2
I'm
minutes
just-
left. We'll do a final thought from everyone and then
Right
we'll
now?
wrap it up. Does that work for everyone? Certainly.
Final?
Please, yeah, final thoughts.
So, great segue. Friedman also said it's
Yeah.
it's the right thing to do. If we do it
You gotta
right.
stop reading Friedman. I think you're-
I'm gonna start reading you now. I'll tell you, I'm okay. Seriously, good job today. Look, let's not underestimate what the US leadership has been in terms of interacting with Lebanon. In spite of all the pressures on our country, there's been a real focus by the Congress and this administration. I don't know how they do it. Having said that, we gotta move on. We need a Lebanon strategy. We need the US leadership re-engaged again. And not only in the region, but in terms of the immediate partners around Lebanon and within Lebanon. And let me bring up 3 issues that we've got to really talk about: refugees, education. We talk about the youth, education, especially the AUB, LAUs of the world.
Yeah.
And lastly, health. Health is going to be a really important point. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Joseph,
What am I required?
One.
you give us your,
Be optimistic, please. I won't say
be
one.
optimistic.
Maybe, yeah, okay, I'll be optimistic and then I'll be optimistic and I'll be a little bit personal if you allow me, and I would like to answer Mrs. Seymoun, I think. Zaytoun. Look, allow me 2 minutes to talk about myself. I left Lebanon in 2005 with the firm idea that I'm not getting back. I'm not going back. I was divorcing from the country. I left it disgusted and I wanted to make my life elsewhere. I've lived in Paris. I lived 4 years in Washington. This is where I met these 2 friends. And with the idea that I wouldn't ever come back. In 2020, after the collapse, after COVID, after the Beirut blast, I chose to come back to Lebanon and to come back to AUB. And I did it for a reason. It was not a purely professional opportunity. It was an envy. So I reverted back all my previous, let's say, decisions not to come back, because I said, okay, I want to have a sort of sense in my what remains of my life. And the only way to do it is to come back to this country and specifically to this institution, because this is where, and I fully agree with my friends, this is where we can change things. I'm not sure that we can change things on the macro level. I'm not sure that I could solve confessionalism, the weapons of Hezbollah, the Arab-Israeli problem, etc. But I could solve on a policy level things like health, education, energy, micro and macroeconomics, and etc. And I want to invest again what remains of my energy in trying to shape some youngsters in order to remain in the country. And I'm convinced that many of the ones who are leaving today the country will probably do the same trajectory that I've done. So this is my last.
I hope so.
Wow, you were saving that for the end, weren't you? Kept that to the very end. Yeah, it's gonna be a tough act to follow, but you have the final,
All I'm gonna do is is actually give all my props to Joe for what he just said, and to be very clear that I sit at this table with an enormous amount of humility. I'm sitting in Washington, so who am I actually to be saying these things? And Joe, what you've done is so powerful. And the only thing I can say is, as a member of the diaspora, that I will recommit my depth of sort of commitment to Lebanon, because I think it's essential. And these are challenges that have to be solved across many borders and boundaries. And I certainly think it's very important to play that role as a bridge and to work as hard as I can and to work as closely with people like you in Lebanon to help make this more hopeful future for our country.